We are joined by the one, the only EvanMiya on the program, EvanMiya.com, founder, creator, genius, as I like to call him, and maybe most importantly, emotionally, a friend of Carter and I's. Evan, it's great to have you here. We did this last year as well when your model updated and launched for the first season, or for last season, excuse me. Your preseason model is out now on EvanMiya.com. We got team ratings, player ratings, and much more. We'll go deep on it in the next 20 minutes. But first off, my friend, welcome back. It's great to see you. How are you?
Doing good. This you have the pleasure of being my first official new season interview that I've done. I'm waiting on doing more until when we get closer to the season, but Sleepers has a special place in my heart, so I figured we'd open it up here.
I'm honored, my friend. I'm honored. You can, by the way, if you're like a Sleepers listener or in the Sleepers universe at all, Evan is a Discord member, which is great. We've had some moments going back and forth with him in the Discord, and yeah, big time supporter of the show. You always have been, so we appreciate that and feel the same way about you. We got some good things to get into here. I have your site up on my laptop here, so if you see me looking at the left, that's what I'm staring at. I want to get into a few specific teams and a few specific players that jumped out to Carter and I as we were going through your database here that once it launched. What's the way to term this, right? Like it didn't launch, your site's always there, but is it like you dropped your preseason data or model? How
Yeah,
would you say it?
I would call my preseason launch where all of a sudden, all the teams and players are updated for what we're expecting to see this season. So I think launch is
Okay.
the right term.
All right, preseason launch. There we have it. We'll get into a lot of good stuff here. So let's start with this. We have a large Purdue audience, and Purdue is our expected number one team in the country. We did our personal AP projection for the Bleacher Report show this week, and we put Purdue at number one, but it is sort of termed as a top two consensus, both Houston and Purdue in the mix. Your model's launch has Houston just narrowly ahead of Purdue. And I think there will be a lot of people who are at least mildly surprised to see the Boilermakers not at number one. Were you mildly surprised that that's where they landed?
I think important context for this when we're looking at preseason statistical models that churn this out is that the order only matters so much. It's really more like the value and the magnitude. So whether you have a team one or two, if they're close, it's neck and neck, and you could get one game into the season, then they'd flip position. So for that sake, I view them very similarly. Off season, I was predicting in my mind, based on looking at the strength of Purdue's roster, I thought Purdue would end up being number one in my preseason rankings because Braden Smith is, spoiler alert, the number one player in the country, according to my model, by a fair margin. I have huge expectations for him. I think he's going to be incredible. And then, of course, they nailed their roster continuity this season in getting back your big three in Braden Smith, TKR, and Fletcher Lawyer, not to mention all these other, important role players, along with bringing in Oscar Clough, bringing in Omer Meyer. So, roster-wise, I have them ranked as the best, on-paper roster in the country by a significant margin. But when you think about other factors that go into my preseason model, a lot of it does have to do with coaching and recent team experience. And when you look at the track record that Houston has had over the last 5 years, they've been in the top four in my rankings by the end of the season for at least the last 4 or 5 years. And so just on face value alone, that carries a lot of weight because they've been so consistent. And so I think that really carried a lot of weight. They were obviously just shy of winning the national championship last year, and they do bring back a lot of their key players from last year who are able to return. So I was a little bit surprised to see Houston number one. I do not have a problem with it whatsoever. I do think that between Houston and Purdue, they're definitely the most deserving teams to be in that top two.
Yeah, I think pretty much anywhere you look is going to have Purdue and Houston in some order at 1 and 2. I was going to ask about the roster rank because, as you mentioned, Purdue is first in your roster rank little column. You can sort by roster rank. What exactly does it mean if you have the number one roster, but you're not the number one team? What is the discrepancy there? You mentioned coaching as something there. I also asked because my Michigan Wolverines are second in roster rank, which makes me very excited. They're fifth on relative rankings. So how is that computed? And is roster rank literally just the players and their individual value summed?
That's correct. It's basically looking at if I were taking this roster and just putting it on paper and saying, I don't know who the coach or the team is, just how good should this collection of players be? That's what the roster rank represents. So Purdue being the number one roster basically means I would rather have their roster than any other roster in the country just based on the players alone, regardless of what team, what coach, etc. So the discrepancies that you see between roster rank and team rank can often tell you a little bit about some of the other factors that are going into this: coaching, recent team success, etc. I wouldn't necessarily interpret it straight as if a team is much higher than their roster ranking, I'm giving their coach a lot of credit. And if they're much worse than their roster ranking, I'm docking them because of coaching. It doesn't just come down to coaching. There are some other factors as well. But seeing those discrepancies certainly can be very interesting. And so, for example, Houston only has the 5th best roster in the country. So if you're taking the Houston label off, you're taking the coach off, and you're just looking at the roster, they would not be the best collection of players in the country. But when you throw all that back into the mix, it all rounds out to being, my model is predicting based on all of these variables that we look at in the preseason to predict team success. When you look at teams like them in the past, like this is the team that is most deserving or most likely to finish number 1 at the end of the year when you consider all of these things.
Fascinating. Okay. Yeah. And as I talk through this, man, I'm going to add my own personal subjective interpretation of what you're kind of leading us through. But Houston, I mean, the last 4 years, like whatever analytics engine you're sorting through, they're almost always number 1 at the end of the regular season. So there is like this proven can't miss element to what that program has become. Maybe I would interpret it as this: Purdue dropping to 2 is not all that crazy given the fact that last year they weren't a top 10 team. With this coach, with a lot of these same pieces, with a defense that just wasn't good enough. I look at your site here. They're the number 1 offense, I would assume by a great margin. And then the defensive rank for Purdue is just 16th. I think it's a good reminder there are still some questions with this roster, even though we think they solved some of these problems. They still got to prove it that they did. So I actually don't hate it the more I look at this. Like, I always feel like if there's something that surprises me, it's something I want to take some time thinking on and possibly alter my own opinions when I look at your site. And a good reminder that Houston's not going anywhere, and Purdue almost needs to be the chaser to get back to that level that they were when Zach Edey was on the roster. One more thing that I'm thinking through as we look at this, and I have the site sorted by roster rank right now because Purdue 1, Michigan 2, as I mentioned. Other teams that are near the top 5 or top 10 here. Louisville has the 6th best roster rank. Kentucky has the 8th best roster rank. And similar situations as we talked through, like the coaching element of this, to Michigan with Dusty May, where it's a 2nd-year coach at a new program and there's been some flux there. What is it that just looking at it, feels like Michigan is almost a little bit elevated, whereas Louisville 19th in your relative ranking, even though they have the 6th best roster rank. That's a pretty large discrepancy. Kentucky also a slight dip from 8th best roster to the 10th best relative ranking. So I guess help me interpret that. Is there a difference between like year 2 Dusty May somehow in your mind versus year 2 Pat Kelsey?
I certainly think with these coaches, part of it is they've only been at these schools for 1 year. And often we can over-index what we saw from them last year, either good or bad. Oftentimes when it's really good in the first year, we just think they're going to just continue to like be even better. And the reality is they still have to do the job this year. You can't just expect the same level of overperformance based on your roster for a 2nd-year coach. There can be some luck involved. So I think in general for these 2nd-year coaches, there's probably a little bit more for some of them, especially Louisville. There's a little bit more pessimism. You can throw Kentucky in there as well. Pessimism that like, hey, just because these coaches performed way above expectation last year based on the pieces that they had available, that you were just expecting them to do that again. I think in Louisville's case in particular, 19th is very low for this team. And I think that I don't necessarily, this is probably one of the data points I disagree with the most. I rarely disagree with my data points. That one I do feel like is probably a little bit too pessimistic. But if I look at the reason why that they have the 6th best roster in the country, but they're being 19th, part of it is in evaluating coach and recent team success. Louisville has been obviously different regime under Pat Kelsey, but they had a history of being pretty poor the years prior. And then last year, I think everyone would acknowledge that Louisville was a pleasant surprise given all of the injury issues that they faced. I think most people were probably ready to write them off in December, January, based on all the injury issues that they had. They ended up being, more obviously in the tournament, finishing close to the top 20. my model doesn't necessarily go in depth and say like, well, you were missing all of these injured players last year. It's basically just looking at like, here's the players that you had, here's how well you did last year. And I think the fact that Louisville finished outside the top 20 on paper, the model's looking at it being like, it was fine first year, but it wasn't great. And so there's a little bit of pessimism for year two. I think when you look at more of the context, you might say, okay, that's a bit over indexing that part, and maybe we should be giving more of the benefit of the doubt to Pat Kelsey. But I think that's part of why they're ranked, more in the late teens there.
Interesting. Okay. Very, very fascinating. And yeah, maybe a reminder too with Louisville. I do feel like the narrative may have been remembered last season as a more positive year than it really was due to the injuries. And I mean, where they finished in March as well. They were a team a lot of people loved. I'm assuming they wouldn't rise like crazy if they won one more game in March, but it is something that Pat Kelsey hasn't done yet, and we need to continue to monitor. I want to keep this rather open-ended here, but just looking at your team ratings, give me a team that your model is high on, that is maybe higher than consensus, or that you believe what your model is selling on.
Yeah, I think the most obvious one right at the top would be Duke. I think Duke is going to be ranked worse than third, most likely in the AP poll. I certainly think a lot of the preseason consensus rankings, I've seen them lower. And I think the reality is that people just say, well, this roster is not as good as last year, which is true. They had a generationally talented roster, especially in terms of NBA potential in those freshmen. But not only are they bringing in a good class of freshmen, but my model predicts really big sophomore years for both Isaiah Evans and Patrick Ngongba. They were players who weren't utilized a ton last year because they had such a talented roster. But in the limited minutes that they played, they showed a lot of potential. They're obviously really highly regarded coming out of high school. And a lot of times these freshmen who aren't used a ton in their freshman year and then really are given a bigger role in their sophomore year, who are that talented, often take big leaps. I'm not saying the same thing, but I look at like a Donovan Clingan, right? He was very, very efficient in his freshman minutes, but he was obviously coming off the bench, and then he was just an absolutely dominant force in his sophomore year. So I see potential for both Evans and Ngongba in that way. And so when you add that level of optimism in for those players, I think Duke is going to be, right in the fold this year. I think the other team I look at that is definitely going to be an eyebrow raiser, and I've already been debating people this offseason about it, is I have Ohio State ranked 18th in the country. I don't think they're likely to be in the top 25 when the season starts in the AP poll. And I certainly think a lot of people are very pessimistic for a variety of reasons. A lot of it comes down to coaching and the fact that, they don't have a proven track record yet, with their coaching staff of being successful. But when you look at what are the most important ways to build a roster in this modern era, I really do believe the teams that are able to retain the key pieces from last year and retain them and keep them, and that being the core of your team, and then bringing in fresh talent through the transfer portal, through the high school ranks to raise that. Statistically, those teams are the often ones that are most successful. And the Buckeyes are bringing back Bruce Thornton, John Mobley, and Devin Royal, who are all really, really solid players. And in Bruce Thornton in particular, I think he is a point guard who is very underrated. I think having him as a top 10 player in the country like I do is probably going to be very much a stretch for a lot of people. But he didn't play on a team that was very successful last year. And yet I think he is one of the most efficient scorers and playmakers in the country as a point guard. And then you look at some of the other talent they brought in, I think it makes sense. And so I'm very high on Ohio State. I think they're going to surprise some people this year.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a fair stance for sure. I think the interesting thing with Ohio State for me, and I don't mean to debate your model by any means because I love your model, but to me, I think you could have made a similar argument last year because they did bring back like Thornton and obviously Royal last year. Mobley was sort of the new face. I do think year two Mobley is a breakout candidate and could be a swing piece. The case last year would have been like, surround those guys with talent. And last year we would have thought talent is Aaron Bradshaw and Sean Stewart, McDonald's All-Americans that were terrible. They're hoping Christoph Tilley is an upgrade, and he may be. He's been a better college player flat out than Bradshaw or Stewart have been. I'm still a little skeptical just that anyone is going to emerge as like a star center next to that same core, because I don't quite frankly understand why Bradshaw wasn't able to do some of that last year, or Stewart. So we'll see, but I think it's totally fair. Talent-wise, you have Ohio State 12th. I think that's totally reasonable. It's all going to come down to what do they do with it. And Bruce Thornton, as you mentioned, sixth in your player model right now. It's a good segue into your player ratings. Let's jump over there. You mentioned Braden Smith is number one, and number one by a long shot. The gap between Braden Smith in your BPR, which is the sortable column that ends up spitting out these rankings, is bigger between him and number two, Yaxel Lendeborg, on this list than it is between Yaxel Lendeborg and all the way down to like 17, 18 on the list. How unusual is that? I mean, is it typical to have such a gap at the top between the number one player and the number two player?
I think the last time we had a gap this large was a player on the same team, Zach Edey, coming back for his final year. But in general, yes, it is very abnormal to have a player in the preseason with that much of a gap. There certainly can be often a consensus player, but for it to be this definitive it is pretty wild. I do think that, Braden Smith won't be the only player considered by many to be the best player in the preseason. I think JT Toppin is certain in the running there as well. But from a model perspective, what Braden Smith does for Purdue, both offensively and defensively, is just there are very few players in history who have been as effective as he is. And the fact that he has stayed in college and is now in his fourth year and he's going to be playing against other teams that have freshmen and sophomores, he's just going to have such an experience advantage here. And he's going to have a better setup than he did last year. And he was already extremely effective last year, really made the most of what they had to work with. And so, I really can't speak highly enough of Braden. I think he's going to be really, really good this year.
Yeah, as do we. We're big fans of Braden's, as my daughter calls him Uncle Braden when she flips through the Final Four book that I brought home. So, big things expected from our preseason National Player of the Year. There's a couple other players that I want to ask you about where they landed here, or maybe some reasoning behind it. Yaxel Lendeborg is number two on this list, behind Braden, ahead of JT Toppin. Which was a little bit of a surprise to me. I obviously love Yaxel and I'm very high on him, but to me, almost similarly to the way Purdue and Houston are kind of viewed in a top tier, I think a lot of people nationally would view Braden and JT Toppin alone in the top tier of individual players for National Player of the Year type candidate awards. Yaxel Lendeborg was phenomenal, a very unique unicorn-esque player at UAB. You could answer this in the context of Yaxel or broader if you want to, but what does your model do with the competition level changes between mid-major players transferring up a level? Because in my head, I would sort of just assume there are questions there. And I looked through some of the other mid-major players that have transferred up a level and where they slot in here. Bennett Sturts, for example, a guy a lot of people think could be an All-American, down at 41st on your list in terms of player ratings in the season. So it's a surprise to me to see Yaxel so high. How does your model handle that type of competition jump?
Yeah, I specifically have a model that looks at how transfers are expected to do when they change from one place to the other and trying to take into account that change in conference level, competition level, all that stuff. What I've often found, just as a general rule, is that players who are really good at multiple things are often the ones who have the highest floor in terms of how they're going to be when they go from, say, the mid-major ranks to the high major ranks. A lot of times players who struggle are players who are maybe scored 20 points per game at the mid-major level, but they don't really do a lot else. And then they go to the high major level, they're facing tougher defenses, they take that away, and then they can't really do a lot else. Yaxel is not just good, not great. He's elite at like scoring, playmaking, and rebounding. In my model, when you pull up his specific profile on my page, he has a scoring grade, a rebounding grade, and a playmaking grade. He is an A or an A plus in all three of those, and that's accounting for his projected skill in those going forward, not just like how he did at UAB last year. It's taking into account competition and all that stuff. He's in the 98th percentile in scoring, 99th percentile in rebounding, 97th in playmaking. That's absurd. It is absurd to have a player who is that well-rounded in all of these different key areas. So it's just really, really hard to see how he's going to be a flop going up a level because he's just so versatile. And I think that's what gives him the edge over, a player like JT Toppin, who is obviously very deserving, and I have him ranked third here. But Yaxel just brings so much to the table.
You got me excited. You got me salivating at the thought of what Yaxel Lendeborg will look like in a Dusty May offense. All right, moving down your player ratings a little bit. We said Bruce Thornton is at 6. He's behind Todd Pettiford and LeBaron Philon, just barely, sort of these college returnee star guards. I found that kind of interesting as a pod together. But right underneath that pod, we have the trio of consensus freshman of the year candidates. We have AJ DeBonsa, Darren Peterson, and Cameron Boozer. All obviously they have to show up on the list in order, but 7, 8, 9. But they have identical BPR ratings of 8.18 heading into the season. I need an explanation here because I sort of hypothesized this on a previous video. Was there any manual element of this that's like, you know what, these three guys are elite, let's just make sure they're the same? How do they all compute at the exact same number coming into the year?
Yeah, generally speaking, I do not do any manual modification of anything with my rankings, but the way that I handle the top of a freshman class is a bit of an exception each year. Basically, the way this works is that the most predictive stat that we have for how good a player is going to be in college is just taking a average of the recruiting rankings that are out there for a class and kind of looking at their composite scores. And oftentimes there's a pretty general trend that if you're at the very top of the class, or if you're 10th or 20th or 50th, there's a general expectation in my data of how well a player like that often performs in their freshman year. And so typically, let's say you have a guy who's consensus ranked 24th in the class. I basically look at all players who are ranked very similarly with similar profiles coming out of high school in the last 10 years and say, okay, how did they perform in their freshman year? And that kind of forms a projection for that player. When you get to the very top of the class, that's a little bit different because the strength of a class overall is often kind of valued by how good are the very best players at the top. In a typical season, the best player in a high school class will typically finish somewhere in the 15 to 20th range nationally in BPR. That might sound a little bit low, but oftentimes the guy who is the best or the second best in the class can be kind of hit or miss as to whether he actually indeed ends up being all-American level or just solid but not spectacular. In previous seasons, we've had situations where we had a number one freshman be kind of in that 15 to 20, 25 range. But in the last two classes, I've had to handle it a little bit differently, especially since the ordering can often be more of a representation of NBA potential than college potential. All that being said, DeBansa, Darren Peterson, and Cameron Boozer are all being talked about in very similar light, both in recruiting circles for NBA potential and in terms of college impact. And so I kind of made a decision to sort of lump them all together and pick a spot that, based on how strong this class is overall, would be roughly where a player like that would end up. Last year, I think I had Cooper Flagg 5th in the preseason. This is a notch below that, but still very good. I think all three of these players are expected to be really high contributors there. And so that's kind of how they all ended up together. So a bit of a manual modification there based on where I thought they would slot in. I'm certainly not like deciding who I personally think is going to be, reordering the rankings of these services here, but this was kind of an exception.
Interesting. All right. I'm glad my suspicion may have been at least on the right track there, because that's very interesting to me. Can I ask you to give some personal analysis on it? Because obviously we have the model in front of us, but the interesting thing about lumping them together to me would be such different situations. Like, you've got Cam Boozer, who, as you spoke to with Duke, is on a team that is loaded with more talent than probably the other two teams put together. BYU is going to be fun and talented. DeBonsa is a huge part of it. Obviously, Richie Saunders and Rob Wright are very good, but it's kind of this three-headed star monster there, whereas Duke has a team full of them. And then you've got Kansas, who Bill Self is publicly coming out and saying, never had a player like this. We're going to go as Darren Peterson goes. I've surrounded him with role players. Let's see what happens. I think it would be reasonable to believe, if they're all similar caliber, that Darren Peterson's likely to have maybe the best individual numbers. Cam Boozer might have the best team success season. AJ DeBonsa might be somewhere in the middle, possibly the first overall pick. So if you had to do your best guess, lump them together preseason, how do you think those three are going to move as the season goes on?
Yeah, I think part of this is that when I predict for a freshman, I'm not taking into account the team that they're on or the context they're in, because all of my player ratings, for the most part, are trying to extract context out of it and just say, how good should this player be? So if these players were on different teams, I would still rank them the same. With that being said, I think based on sort of what I've been hearing and how people have been talking about these players, I feel like the of those three, the player I would have the most faith in to finish in the top 5 this season would probably be Darren Peterson at Kansas. I just think the team is going to be built around him, and he has all of the college skills to not just, be a flashy player and score, but really just make this team tick. And so I think he's the one I'm most excited about to see how he does. And if I had to put my guess on one, that's who I would go with.
Great answer. Okay, I got two more questions for you before we get out of here. There's so much international flair to this game now. It's a totally different sport in a million different ways than it was 5 years ago. But I think this, more than any other element of the sport this summer, the story of it for me has been all of these professional basketball players, all of these guys that are seasoned from international clubs, some 23 years old, coming over to college with who knows how many years of eligibility left. I can imagine it's a different challenge for someone like you trying to figure out how to grade them, how much value to assign to them than it is even looking at high school rankings or however you had done it previously. How have you maneuvered that as this sport has evolved in that direction?
Yeah. So the internationals is interesting because really, even 3 years ago, this really wasn't a thing. Last year, we had several notable international players, but you could count them on one or two hands in terms of players who are expected to be impactful. This year, we have 50 or more players who are all equally being hyped as being really, really good college players potentially. I'm working on something for next season because of this influx, which will be much more statistics based on looking at their international production, what league they were in, and then projecting that into college and saying how have players like this done or how would they be expected to do. The way I handled this year was I basically took similar to the freshmen, I took basically some different consensus opinions on how good all these international players are going to be in college. I roughly slotted that into where players with similar profiles in the past would have been ranked in Division One going into the year and where they finished. And that kind of turned into a rough ordering of these players and then a rough assigning of roughly where they're ranked this year. With that being said, I think that my rankings are going to be a little bit conservative for some people in terms of the impact that some of these guys are expected to have. And I think the reason for that is oftentimes when we have a new variable like these international players, we often end up only talking at the end of the season about the ones who ended up being really good and saying like, see, this team brought in this international player. He was fantastic. This is the way of the future. And then we just sort of forget about the guys who didn't really make much of an impact. I mean, like last year at Creighton, what was his name? Fedor Zugic was like, that's literally my point. I almost forgot his name because I talked to several really informed people who said this guy's going to be amazing. And then he was pretty much a non-factor. So I think with all that being said, there's a healthy level of not pessimism, but conservatism in terms of saying, I think these players are going to be good, but I'm not going to immediately project that this guy is going to be an All-American level because some of them probably will be, but many of them are being talked about that way and won't be. So in general, I think they're probably a little bit more lower on some of these guys than what people think or expect for their team. Some of them will be much better than that. Some of them also will not be as good as people think. And so we'll kind of see how it shakes out. But going forward for future seasons, I'm going to be having a little bit more of a statistically driven, objective approach to this because I think it's very needed.
Fascinating. All right. Thanks for the context there. And yeah, unless I'm completely overlooking someone, I believe I see one international player in the top 100 rankings. Is it Fulgaris at Iowa?
Yeah. I think so. Yes, but he's not even a new international import.
Yeah, right. He's been in the sport, right? So where is the I'm clicking through, but do you know off the top of your head where the top ranked new international import is?
I think it might be let me see here.
I'm scrolling through just trying to find it, not to put you on the spot, but I'm just curious, honestly.
Yeah, it might. I think it's somewhere in the top, the 200s or early 300s.
Fascinating.
I don't remember who the exact name is because there's several that are close.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, last question for me. It's also going to put you on the spot a little bit with this, but so I know from being in group chats with you and just being your friend, honestly, talking through stuff, you can use your model to get a competitive advantage in fun games. Like, I don't know, if you do fantasy college basketball, you could certainly use this to help you. In March, when you've got like a survivor challenge or pick'em challenge, even filling out a bracket, obviously you can use your data to try and help you win things like that. March is fluky. I say it all the time. You never know, but I feel like I have a good sense of your approach from the past, and you're usually pretty good at identifying teams that are not everyone's consensus. I mean, I feel like I remember texts from you and even just talking through it with you where if you want to win a bracket pool or something, you can't just pick who everyone's picking. You're trying to find teams that are elsewhere from that. So answer this however you want. Maybe not necessarily the most likely four teams to make the final four. We can read the top four on your list if we wanted that. But if this was March second week right now, without seeing a bracket, who would be four teams that would fit your typical approach of not picking the consensus but still trying to get good value here?
That's tough because like we don't know exactly where these teams are seated. But
Sure.
if I'm picking a Final Four that's not just my top four, I'm picking Houston and Purdue because I do think those are the two best teams in the sport. I think it would be pretty dumb at this point not to. But I'm gonna, for the sake of this exercise, I'm not gonna pick Duke and Florida at 3 and 4. I'll pick UConn at 6. And then as kind of my like dart throw, I will go with let's go with Illinois. I
Wow.
have them ranked a lot higher than people are expecting. I have them ranked ninth in the country. I really think the talent that they've brought in, and the players that they have returning are really good. I think that they're being overlooked a little bit. The Ty Rodgers injury is an interesting one because right now I have him expected to be healthy. If he were out, that ranking would drop a few spots, but I still think this team is very good. So let's go with Illinois as a fun fourth pick there.
Wow. Our Illinois audience is going to love that. So great answer. All right. Thank you, Evan. That was fun. Can you please give the plug on all things EvanMiya? Also, if I know you, you're constantly working on something brand new that's going to be exciting and surprise everyone. So if you have anything to tease, feel free. Otherwise, just let people know where they can find you.
Yeah, nothing to tease at the moment. I'll kind of keep that close to the vest. But everything you can find is at evanmiya.com. All the stuff that we've talked about. And there's a lot more you can dig into if you're a subscriber there. I also have links to all of my social media platforms on there. Super active on Twitter, but I also do stuff over on Instagram, TikTok, things like that. I have a blog as well where I really dive more deep into a lot of the stuff that I do. So you can subscribe over there. And I also did just launch a little bit of a merch store. So if you're interested in picking up one of these hats, you can find that there too. Everything at evanmiya.com.
Yeah, baby. Got to do it. And okay, I believe I have this right. Your basic paid account is $30 a year.
Yeah, so the lowest tier is $5 a month or 30 a year. That's correct.
So I have a surprise for you. Um, there's a member of our Discord, Fam, who infamously had a little beef with you last year. There was a random Fam's like one of the most loyal sleepers listeners ever, objectively like a good, fun person for us. And he was just like backing you into a corner, fighting you. We were all like, what is going on for like 48 hours last March? And I don't know if this is a peace offering or what, but Fam heard that we were doing this and reached out to me and says that he is going to buy 6 Discord members from our sleepers community a year of a subscription to evanmiya.com. So actually, the first one, I already did a little raffle for this. I spun a wheel. Coleman's Burner from our Discord is getting a year to evanmiya.com. Coleman's Burner, I'll reach out and give you that. Next week on the Sleepers podcast, every single day, we're going to draw one name from the Discord. So there's a little selfish plug. If you want an Evan Media subscription or a chance at one, join the Sleepers Discord. You might get a chance. If you have an account in the Sleepers Discord, you are already entered. Next week, we'll do 5 giveaways of 5-year subscriptions to evanmiya.com, courtesy of Fam, by the way.
Bam, you're always going to be number one in my heart.
You got to love it. Thank you, Evan. We appreciate you. And we'll talk soon, my friend.
Sounds great.